The restaurant was a cathedral of hushed elegance, a place where money whispered and celebration was curated with the precision of a stage play. For weeks, this scene had lived vividly in Eleanor's mind, a beacon of hope she had steered towards. She had pictured the soft, buttery glow of the chandeliers casting halos on the crystal glasses. She'd imagined the rich, complex aroma of aged wine mingling with the scent of roasted duck and truffles. Most importantly, she had rehearsed the look in her husband Richard's eyes when he would raise a glass, not just to his friends, but to her, a silent acknowledgement of the 30 years she had stood as the bedrock of his world. This was his 50th birthday, a monumental milestone, and she had orchestrated every detail to be a testament to their shared journey. But the reality was a cruel distortion of her fantasy. The symphony of clinking silverware and happy murmurs felt discordant, a soundtrack to her own suffocating isolation. Richard, her Richard, sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, not as a husband celebrating with his wife, but as a triumphant monarch holding court. His laughter, a booming, theatrical sound she once adored, now seemed to carve out a space that didn't include her. He was surrounded by his disciples, business partners with calculating eyes, golf buddies whose jokes were as loud as their plaid trousers, and their wives. A gallery of women with immaculate manicures and smiles that were expertly applied, but held no warmth. Eleanor was seated to his left, a position that should have signified honor, but felt more like a forgotten accessory, a prop to complete the picture of a successful man. She wore her deep emerald silk dress, a garment she had saved for this very occasion. Years ago, Richard had told her it made her eyes look like jewels from a sunken treasure chest. Tonight, he hadn't even glanced at her long enough to register the color. She had spent an hour on her hair, trying to recapture a style he once complimented. A futile effort to be seen by a man who had long since stopped looking. An hour ago, maybe more, time had begun to blur. She had made an attempt to bridge the chasm between them. Leaning in, she had tried to thread her voice into the tapestry of his boisterous storytelling. "Richard, darling," she began, her tone soft, intimate, a secret, just for him. "Do you remember our trip to Venice for your 30th birthday? We found that tiny cafe in the alley, and you said—" He didn't even turn his head. He simply raised a hand, a gesture that was both a pat and a dismissal, and placed it on her forearm for a fraction of a second. "Not now, Ellie. John was just about to tell us the punchline about the merger." His voice was indulgent, as if speaking to a child who had interrupted adult conversation. The diminutive Ellie, once a tender whisper in the dark, now felt like a public belittlement. She physically recoiled, the warmth of her hand where he'd touched it turning instantly cold. The precious memory of Venice, of their younger selves sharing cheap pasta and dreams under an Italian moon, shattered and dissolved. She retreated into herself, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. It was a Chateau Margaux, a wine whose price tag could fund a small vacation, yet it tasted like bitter ash on her tongue. Her eyes remained fixed on him, not with adoration, but with the detached focus of an anthropologist studying a foreign creature. She saw the ghost of the man she had married, the fiercely ambitious, irresistibly charming boy with a fire in his soul that promised to build empires. She had been drawn to that fire, had gladly offered her own ambitions as kindling to make it burn brighter. But somewhere along the way, the fire that once warmed her had grown into an inferno that only illuminated him, casting her, and everything she was, into the deepest, coldest shadows. He wasn't her partner anymore. He was a performer, and this dinner was his grandest stage. A profound, hollow ache settled in her chest, an old acquaintance that had become her constant companion. It was the loneliness of being invisible. She felt like a ghost at her own feast, a feast she had painstakingly arranged. She had spent weeks on the phone with the maitre d', deliberating over the menu, tasting the wines, curating the guest list to include every person who mattered to him. She had done it all as an ultimate act of love, and her reward? To be utterly and completely erased from the narrative of the evening. Her gaze drifted down the table, a sea of unfamiliar faces animated by conversations about stock portfolios, tax shelters, and upcoming ski trips to Aspen. No one made eye contact with her. No one tried to draw her in. One of the wives, a woman named Carol, had turned to her earlier and asked with manufactured sweetness, "Eleanor, how is your lovely garden coming along?" Eleanor, grateful for the crumb of attention, began to describe the new climbing roses she had planted. But before she could finish her second sentence, Carol's eyes had glazed over and darted away, her attention captured by a louder, more important voice down the table. The dismissal was so swift, so complete, It was as if Eleanor had simply vanished mid-sentence. She set her wine glass down on the crisp linen tablecloth. The quiet, solid sound was an anchor in the dizzying sea of her neglect. Her heart began to beat a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. 30 years. The number echoed in her mind. 30 years of being the silent, efficient support system. She had raised their 2 children, now grown and living their own lives. She had managed their home, a sprawling, empty testament to his success. She had been the steadfast, reliable wind beneath his soaring wings, all while her own dreams, of opening a small bookstore, of finishing her degree in art history, were carefully folded, packed away, and stored in the attic of their life, gathering a thick, settled dust. She had always told herself it was a partnership, a division of labor for a shared goal. But looking at him now, resplendent and laughing, absorbing the admiration from every corner of the room, she saw the devastating truth. It had never been a partnership. It had been a one-man show, and she was the unpaid, uncredited stage manager, working tirelessly in the dark so his spotlight could shine ever brighter. And in that crushing moment, something inside her finally fractured. It wasn't a dramatic, shattering explosion. It was a quiet, profound tear in the very fabric of her being. The thick, comfortable blanket of acceptance she had wrapped around her heart for decades began to unravel, thread by thread, revealing something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. A clean, sharp, liberating anger. And with that anger came a sudden, desperate, primal need to breathe air that wasn't recycled from his monumental ego, to stand in a place where her shadow was her own. It was in the midst of this cold, internal fury that she first truly noticed him. He was not one of the main servers assigned to their boisterous table, but a younger man who moved along the periphery with a quiet, almost invisible grace. He was tall and slender, with dark, thoughtful eyes that seemed to take in everything without being intrusive. While the other staff buzzed around Richard and his loudest guests, this waiter operated in the spaces they ignored. He was the one who refilled her water glass without her ever having to ask, his movements swift and silent. He was the one who, after she'd unconsciously pushed her bread plate an inch away, moved it back into place with a subtle, reassuring gesture. She hadn't paid him any mind at first. He was part of the restaurant's machinery, another cog in the grand performance of the evening. But now, sitting in her bubble of profound alienation, his small, considerate actions began to stand out in stark relief against the backdrop of her husband's flagrant disregard. Each time he passed, a quiet current of acknowledgement seemed to flow from him. It wasn't flirtatious or familiar. It was something far more rare and precious. It was simple, human courtesy. He saw her. He saw a person sitting at the table, a glass that needed filling, a plate that needed placing. He saw her when her own husband did not. The main courses arrived with a theatrical flourish. A line of waiters descended upon the table, placing plates before the guests. Richard's steak, a massive porterhouse, was set before him with a reverent, "For the birthday, gentlemen." Richard beamed, raising his knife and fork like a conductor's baton, ready to lead the orchestra of his own satisfaction. Eleanor's plate, a delicate sea bass with saffron risotto, was placed in front of her almost as an afterthought by a harried server. But then the quiet waiter appeared at her elbow. He leaned in, his voice a low, respectful murmur that was only for her. "Excuse me, madam. The chef recommends a squeeze of lemon to bring out the flavor of the fish." He gestured to a small, muslin-wrapped lemon wedge on her plate that she hadn't even noticed. "If you wish, of course." She looked up at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. His eyes were kind. There was no artifice in them, no expectation. He was simply a professional doing his job with a degree of care that bordered on artistry. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice sounding foreign and tight in her own ears. "Thank you, I didn't see that." He gave her a small, genuine smile. It wasn't the wide, toothy grin of her husband's friends. It was a simple, upward curve of the lips that acknowledged her response. "My pleasure. My name is Leo, if you should need anything at all." And then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the dining room. Leo. A simple name. A simple act of kindness. And yet, it felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She squeezed the lemon over her fish, the sharp, bright scent cutting through the cloying sweetness of the expensive perfume worn by the woman beside her. She took a bite. The fish was exquisite, the flavors bursting on her tongue. It was a perfect meal she couldn't taste. Her attention was once again pulled to the head of the table. Richard was telling another story, this one about a disastrous fishing trip where he had supposedly wrestled a marlin for 3 hours. The story, which she knew for a fact had been wildly embellished over the years, held his audience captive. They hung on his every word, erupting in laughter at the punchline. Through it all, he never once glanced her way. He didn't ask if she was enjoying her meal. He didn't try to include her in the story, even though she had been the one who had spent hours treating his sunburn after the epic battle. The final, deepest cut came with the dessert. A magnificent chocolate cake, tiered and decadent, was carried out by two waiters, a single brilliant candle flickering on top. The room erupted into a ragged rendition of Happy Birthday. Eleanor plastered a smile on her face, the muscles in her cheeks aching with the effort. She sang along, her voice a hollow whisper lost in the chorus. Richard stood, his face flushed with wine and adulation. He blew out the candle to thunderous applause, and then he raised his glass. "Thank you," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for being here. My friends, my partners, my family." He gestured grandly around the table, his arm sweeping across the faces of his friends. To be surrounded by people who support you, who believe in you, that's the greatest gift a man can have. To success, and to another 50 years of it. The table roared its approval. "To Richard!" they all cheered. Eleanor's wine glass remained on the table. Her hand was frozen in her lap. He hadn't mentioned her. He had talked about support, about family, and his eyes had swept right over her as if she were a pane of glass. 30 years of her life, of her unwavering support, had not even earned a passing mention in his moment of triumph. It was a public declaration of her irrelevance. The smile on her face didn't just fade, it felt like it cracked and fell from her face in pieces. The room seemed to tilt, the cheerful noise of the party warping into a distant, mocking drone. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by an unnerving, icy calm. The anger from before was gone, replaced by something much harder and clearer: resolve. It was then that Leo reappeared. He moved to her side to clear her dinner plate, which she had barely touched. His movements were deft and unobtrusive, as always, but this time, he paused. He saw the look on her face, the devastation in her eyes, the single silent tear that was tracing a path down her cheek. His professional mask flickered for just a second, replaced by a look of genuine human concern. He leaned in again, his voice even lower this time, a shield against the noise. "Madam," he said softly, "is everything all right? Can I get you something? A glass of water?" The question, so simple, so basic, was the one her husband should have asked hours ago. It was a question he hadn't asked her in years. To hear it from a stranger was both a final, crushing indictment of her marriage and, paradoxically, a key unlocking a door she never knew existed. She looked from the sincere, worried eyes of this young waiter to the back of her husband's head. Richard was laughing again, oblivious, invisible. She was utterly invisible. And the wildest, most audacious, most liberating thought she'd ever had in her life took root in her mind. It wasn't about this young man, Leo. It was about what he represented: an escape, a witness, an acknowledgement that she was, in fact, a real person sitting in this chair. She turned her gaze back to Leo. Her voice when she spoke was clear and steady, devoid of the tremor she expected to find. It was a voice she hadn't heard herself use in a very long time. She looked into Leo's concerned eyes, and in that moment, the cacophony of the party seemed to recede, becoming a distant, irrelevant hum. The entire universe narrowed to the space between them, to his simple, humane question: "Is everything all right?" For 30 years, she had been the one asking that question. Of her children when they were sick, of Richard when he came home weary from work, of the guests in her home. No one ever thought to ask it of her because Eleanor was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who was always all right. To hear those words directed at her, from a stranger, felt like a dam breaking inside her chest. All the unspoken frustrations, the quiet heartaches, the lonely nights, and the profound invisibility of her existence swelled into a single, powerful wave of clarity. She was not all right. She hadn't been all right for a very, very long time. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it felt like the loudest word she had ever spoken. She saw a flicker of surprise in Leo's eyes, the professional mask giving way to genuine empathy. He held his position, not moving away, granting her the dignity of his full attention. He didn't offer platitudes or look embarrassed. He simply waited. Her gaze shifted one last time to her husband. Richard was now accepting a cigar from one of his friends, laughing as he fumbled with the cutter. He was in his own world, a world he had built for himself, a world where she was merely a silent investor whose contributions were long forgotten. He was celebrating 50 years of his life, and in doing so, he had shown her that her own life had been put on hold for nothing. The partnership she had cherished was a figment of her imagination. The audacious thought that had taken root moments before now blossomed into a full, unshakable decision. It wasn't born of malice or revenge. It was born of a desperate need for self-preservation. It was the primal scream of a soul that refused to be silent for one more second. She had two choices: sit here and slowly die inside, or stand up and walk away. For the first time in 3 decades, she chose herself. She turned back to Leo. The din of the party returned to her ears, but it sounded different now. Distant, foreign, like a television playing in another room. Her own voice, however, was calm and clear, imbued with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You've been very kind," she began, looking at him directly. "You are perhaps the only person who has actually seen me tonight." Leo's expression was unreadable, but he didn't deny it. He held her gaze, a silent witness to her quiet revolution. "My husband," she continued, a sad, ironic smile touching her lips, "is celebrating the greatest gift a man can have. His success, his friends." She gestured with a slight nod toward the head of the table. "He is exactly where he wants to be, surrounded by everything he values." She paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. This was it, the point of no return. "I find," she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing him in, "that I have no appetite for this celebration any longer. I am leaving." This time, surprise was clear on his face. He likely expected her to retreat to the powder room or perhaps to the valet for an early car. But Eleanor wasn't finished. The most radical part of her plan was yet to come. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about making a statement, not to her husband, who wouldn't notice, but to herself. It was about not leaving alone. It was about leaving with the one person who had acknowledged her existence. "You finish your shift soon?" she asked. It was a wild guess, a shot in the dark. Leo blinked, taken aback by the sudden personal question. "In about 15 minutes, madam." "Good," Eleanor said, a newfound confidence flowing through her veins. She reached into her purse, her movements deliberate and sure. She pulled out her wallet, removed several crisp $100 bills, far more than enough to cover her uneaten meal and a generous tip, and placed them discreetly on the table beside her. Then she looked him straight in the eye, her request both a plea and a command. "My husband ignored me at his birthday dinner. I am walking out of this restaurant and I am not going back to the life I had when I walked in." She leaned forward slightly. "And I would very much like it if you would come with me." Leo's jaw went slack. His professional composure, so steadfast throughout the evening, finally crumbled. He looked from her to the money on the table, then to Richard, still laughing and oblivious at the head of the table, and finally back to her. He saw the desperation, yes, but he also saw the iron resolve in her eyes. He saw a woman at the absolute edge, not of madness, but of a profound and terrifying rebirth. He could have said no. He should have said no. It was unprofessional, risky. He could lose his job. But he had also been a silent observer of the entire painful drama. He had seen her hopeful anticipation curdle into quiet devastation. He had seen her husband's casual cruelty. And he had seen the moment the light of acceptance in her eyes was extinguished and replaced by the fire of rebellion. He saw a human being who was asking not for a savior, but for an accomplice in her own liberation. A long moment passed between them, an entire lifetime condensed into a few heartbeats. The noise of the party raged on, unheard by either of them. Finally, Leo gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "My coat is in the back," he said, his voice low and steady. "Meet me by the front entrance in 5 minutes." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy washed over Eleanor. She hadn't realized how much she had staked on his answer until that moment. She gave him a nod of her own, a silent pact sealed between two strangers in the heart of a celebration that had become awake. As Leo turned and walked away, disappearing with his usual quiet grace toward the staff quarters, Eleanor took one last look at the scene. Nothing had changed. No one had noticed their intense, life-altering conversation. No one was looking at her. It was as if she had already been gone for hours. With a deep breath that felt like the first true breath of her life, Eleanor stood up. She didn't push her chair back with a clatter or make a grand dramatic scene. She simply rose to her feet with a quiet dignity that was all her own. She smoothed down her emerald silk dress, a final farewell gesture to the woman who had worn it with such naive hope. Then, without a single glance back, She turned and walked away from the table, from her husband, from the 30 years of shadows she had called a life. She walked with her head held high, her steps even and sure, a queen abdicating a throne she had never wanted, heading toward an unknown future with only the promise of a stranger's coat and 5 minutes to freedom. The walk from the table to the restaurant's grand, wood-paneled entrance was the longest and shortest journey of Eleanor's life. Each step was a deliberate act of severing a tie. With each footfall on the plush, patterned carpet, she felt the weight of years of silent compromises and unmet needs begin to lift from her shoulders. She expected a hand on her arm, her name to be called, some acknowledgement of her departure. But there was nothing. The party continued, a self-contained universe of celebration that did not require her presence to exist. If Richard or any of his guests noticed her exit, they likely assumed she was heading to the restroom. The thought was both infuriating and, in a strange way, freeing. Her invisibility had become her shield, her escape hatch. She pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the cool night air. The city sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the gentle hum of traffic, the chatter of people passing by on the sidewalk, were a welcome balm after the suffocating noise of the party. The air smelled of damp pavement and freedom. She stood under the restaurant's tasteful awning, a solitary figure in an emerald silk dress, feeling like a newly emerged butterfly, still wet and fragile, testing the strength of her wings. A few minutes later, the door opened again. It was Leo. He had changed out of his waiter's uniform and was now wearing simple dark jeans and a plain gray sweater. He held a light jacket in his hands. He looked younger than she'd realized, perhaps in his late 20s, with an earnestness in his eyes that she had not mistaken. He approached her not with the deference of a waiter, but with the quiet respect of an equal. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. It was the last chance, the final off-ramp before the highway of her new life began. Eleanor looked back through the large window into the warm, glowing restaurant. She could see the party, a tableau vivant of a life she no longer belonged to. She saw Richard, a cigar in one hand, a glass of brandy in the other, completely absorbed. He hadn't noticed. He wouldn't notice, she suspected, for quite some time. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, turning back to Leo. He nodded, accepting her answer without judgment. They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by a single impulsive act of rebellion. "So," Leo said, a hint of a gentle, uncertain smile on his face. "Where to?" Eleanor looked up and down the bustling city street. The towering buildings were dotted with a million lights, each one a window into a million different lives, a million different stories. For 30 years, her story had been written for her, its plot and direction dictated by someone else's needs. Now, the pages were blank. It was a terrifying and exhilarating thought. She had no plan, no destination, and for the first time, that felt like a gift. She returned his smile, a genuine, unpracticed smile that reached her eyes. "I have absolutely no idea," she confessed. "And that, I think, is the most wonderful part of it all." Leo didn't offer to lead. He didn't suggest a bar or a coffee shop. He simply stood by her side, a quiet presence, allowing her to be the author of her next chapter. Her decision to leave had never been about him, about finding a new man to replace the old one. It had been about her. His presence was simply the catalyst, the proof that she was worthy of being seen. He was the kind stranger who had held the door open for her as she fled a burning building. What lay ahead was for her to discover on her own. She took a breath and turned to walk down the street, away from the restaurant, away from the glow of the party. Leo fell into step beside her, a comfortable silence settling between them. They weren't walking toward a shared future. They were simply walking in the same direction, for now. As she walked, Eleanor thought about the woman in the emerald dress who had entered that restaurant a few hours ago, filled with a desperate, fading hope. She was no longer that woman. That woman had died somewhere between the main course and the birthday cake. In her place was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had finally chosen to be the main character in her own story. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, it was hers.